Hey guys, welcome back to Hyrule Park, where I am building a theme park based on The Legend of Zelda and Planet Coaster 2. And here we are with episode 19 today, back in Zora's domain, and this episode is really the second half of what we started in episode 18. So last episode was all about getting this plaza area to feel more like an actual place in the park. Not just a coaster flying through some cliffs and waterfalls, but like a real little pocket of Zora's domain, where guests could stop for a bit, grab a coffee, hang out by the water, watch the coaster go by, all that sort of stuff. So that's where Riverfoam Café came from, and that little open air coffee shop that we worked on last episode. Then everything kind of spilled out from there into the surrounding plaza. So the bridges, the layered paths, the water, the greenery, all the little details that hopefully make this area feel a little bit more lived in. And I was really happy with where that landed. But even after all that, the ride itself still had obviously a lot of work left to go because we didn't touch the ride during that episode. But yeah, Zora's Plunge is what I'm going to call it. It can't just pass through this plaza and then we can call it a day. If this coaster is going to be one of the main attractions in Zora's domain, and really the entire park, then the station, the queue, the supports, and all the ride side pieces need to feel like they really belong here too, right? And that's what this episode is mostly about. So taking the coaster side of this area and trying to bring it up to the same level as the plaza around it, which is a weird challenge because a coaster station can very easily become just a coaster station. You know, like a platform, a box around it, roof over the track, queue path leading in, good enough. But for this park, and especially for Zora's domain, I didn't want it to feel that plain. I wanted it to feel more like some sort of ceremonial launch point for the coaster and have it built into the domain, something that still functions like a ride station, obviously, but has a little bit more purpose to it than just being the place where guests get on the coaster. The other piece of that, which I talked about a lot in the last episode, is that this whole plaza is pretty compact, relatively speaking. I didn't give myself a ton of room here, and that was intentional, but it also means that every structure that I place in here really has to be handled pretty carefully. So if the station gets too big, it'll probably overwhelm the plaza. If it's too simple, it'll feel underbuilt compared to everything around it. And then if it's too busy, the whole area just starts to feel more chaotic. So that was really the balancing act I was trying to figure out through this build. And the boarding station was really the first step in that. I wanted this building to have some weight to it, like it was an important structure in this part of the domain and this part of the park, not just a little shed where the coaster happens to load. So going off the design language of the plaza, I really tried to lean into more curved edges, more rounded forms, more of the marble and the blue Zora architecture, of course, instead of just doing a box with a roof on top. And because I apparently enjoy making things hard for myself, that meant the roof became a whole situation, which we probably won't dive too much into because I've complained about roofs too much in this series. This is one of those things in my head. I had a pretty clear idea of what I wanted to do. Like, I wanted this station to have this rounded, elegant shape to it. Something that felt like it was part of Zora's domain architecture, where everything has a little bit of a flow to it, a little bit of movement, nothing feels too harsh or too boxy. But then when you actually start building that in Planet Coaster, especially with the pieces that are mostly meant to behave in straight lines, it becomes a lot less elegant very quickly. A box is easy, you know, I can do boxes all day, maybe not well, but I can do them. You put 4 walls up, you throw a roof on it, you dress it up a bit, and you're good to go. But the second you start trying to make something rounded or semi-rounded, or even just pretending to be rounded, all of a sudden every piece is kind of fighting you a little bit. And that was really the first big thing I was dealing with here. I didn't want the station to feel like this totally separate building that just happened to be next to the plaza. I wanted it to feel like it was connected to the same design language, like I said, as everything else. So that meant the marble, the blue accents, the more decorative trim pieces, and then trying to keep those curved edges that I had started using a lot of in the plaza. The challenge is that a coaster station is already kind of a rigid thing if you think about it. Like, the track is where it is, the platform is where it is, the entrance and exit points are only so flexible. So you're not starting with a blank canvas in the same way you are with a coffee shop or a decorative bridge. You're starting with a very functional ride piece, and then you're trying to convince it to look like it belongs in this fantasy water kingdom, which is not always a smooth conversation. I'll say that. I think that's part of why I spent so much time on this area overall. It wasn't just make the station pretty, it was like, how do I make the station feel intentional from every angle? Because this thing is right in the middle of the plaza. Guests are going to be walking past it, under the coaster, around the water, over the bridges. It's not hidden away in the back of the land somewhere. So if this building looks wrong or too plain or too bulky, the whole plaza kind of suffers from that, right? It becomes the thing your eye goes to, but not in a good way. And that was the part that I kept coming back to. I wanted it to be a focal point, but not in a way where it was screaming for attention, more like it belongs there and it has enough presence that you understand this is where the attraction begins. In my mind, this coaster isn't just here as a coaster that was built in Zora's domain. The theme park version of it is more like this ceremonial tour through the domain, if that makes sense. Like you're boarding this important structure, you're passing through the architecture, you're weaving through the water and the cliffs, and then eventually that big dive section becomes more of like that dramatic moment of the ride. So everything kind of sets up that big moment. So with the station, I wanted to plant that idea early, even if the story isn't super literal. I just wanted the feeling to be there, like this is where that experience starts. And kind of going back specifically to the boarding station, like you'll see me messing around with a couple different designs throughout this building, and it's very much one of the parts of this park project where I'm not totally sure what the answer is yet. I have like a general direction, but I'm kind of feeling it out as I go. Like I'll leave this entry to and exit from the boarding station with the blue trim, almost like outward bending feature for a while, just because I couldn't think of something else and it was good enough, so to speak, for the time being. And then eventually when I get closer to finishing this building, it kind of dawns on me that I don't need to be so fancy with every single aspect of this building. I don't need to try too hard everywhere, you know what I mean? And something simple with the trim can work just as effectively and look cleaner and more seamless. And eventually I come to that realization and I do fix it. And that's usually how these builds end up working for me. Like I have one solid idea, like rounded Zora boarding station, and then the rest of the process is just me trying to figure out what that actually means in Planet Coaster pieces, right? And sometimes that works out pretty quickly. Other times I spend way too long rotating pieces by minimal degrees, staring at it, deciding I hate it, moving it back, deciding I liked it better the first way, and then somehow 20 minutes of my life has disappeared. That's probably the most accurate description of my building process, honestly. One thing with the coffee shop though, last episode, obviously with the glass dome, I liked how that gave Zora's domain a slightly more elegant, clean, almost aquatic feel. I did want to bring some of that into the station too, just not in the exact same way. Like the cafe could be a little more delicate, more decorative because it was a guest space. There was this coffee shop. It was a relaxed plaza element. The station needed to feel stronger than that. Obviously still elegant, still Zora, but with a little more weight to it because it's supporting this major attraction. So that became the balance, like marble and stone to make it feel important, maybe some blue accents to keep it light enough for Zora's domain, curves and rounded edges to keep it from feeling like a generic station building, and then not too bulky so it didn't end up being this huge heaping pile of stone in the center of the plaza. I also wanted to make sure it wasn't too tall right away. That's something I've been trying to pay more attention to in the park overall, like how tall things are compared to what's around them. Because if everything is trying to be this big iconic structure, then nothing really gets to be iconic. Everything is just yelling at the same volume. And in this area, the coaster already gives you a lot of height and movement, and the waterfalls, the cliffs give you height too, so the station doesn't need to be massive, it just needed to feel like it mattered. And that's probably a better way to say what I was going for here. Not huge, just important. And that's kind of where those first shapes started coming from, trying to frame the platform in a way that feels designed but not over-designed. Trying to give the building a front-facing identity without making it feel like a totally separate thing from the rest of the plaza, which sounds very thoughtful when I say it now, but in the footage, in the actual process, it's mostly just me moving marble pieces around until my brain decides one version is slightly less annoying than the other. But that is my process. Inside the station here, I was mostly just trying to make it feel less empty and less like a plain loading platform, because for me that can happen pretty quickly with stations. Like I'll get the main shape done, the roof on, and from the outside it might look pretty finished, but then you move the camera inside and it's kind of just like walls, platform, track, and voila, I've made a hallway with a roller coaster in it. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time giving the inside some of that same Zora treatment too. Nothing too over the top, because in reality, guests are really only going to be in here for a short amount of time, but enough that it still feels like this is part of the same world as the plaza and the building outside. And to this point, I've used a lot of blue glow, glass, marble, and curved shapes throughout Zora's domain, but I also wanted the water elements to feel like it was actually worked into the architecture itself, not just waterfalls in the background, but smaller like decorative water elements that make the buildings feel like they were designed by the Zoras, not just decorated after the fact. And that's kind of the look I was going for with the fountains, almost like these little ceremonial wall fountains or water features built into the station. It's not meant to be this huge focal point, but more one of those details that help sell the elegance of the area. That's been the word I keep coming back to with Zora's domain, is elegant. Everything here should feel a little bit more refined than some of the other lands in this park. And I've talked about this before, but like Lost Woods can be messy and overgrown. Kakariko can be weathered and a little uneven. Goron City, whenever we get back there, can be chunky and heavy and rough around the edges. But Zora's Domain should feel more graceful than that. Still natural, still built into cliffs and water and all that, but there's a level of intention to the architecture that I wanted to keep pushing. And the inside here is, I guess, just a small little microcosm of that. The station itself is still functional, obviously, it has to be, but adding the little details makes it feel a bit more like a proper entrance point to the ride instead of just a loading area. And that's important because we're about to get into the part of the coaster that really needs to sell the identity of the coaster. So the station and plaza are the setup, but the dive element is the signature moment. That's the part where the name of the ride actually has to mean something. I can't just be calling it Zora's Plunge and then have the plunge be like a normal coaster drop with a couple rocks nearby. So once I got that station feeling at least somewhat in the right direction, the next big thing for me was figuring out how to theme that dive in a way that felt worthy of being the centerpiece and sort of the namesake for the ride. But actually, before I get too far ahead of myself with that dive section, I think it makes more sense to talk through the queue here for a bit, because the dive is obviously the big signature moment for Zora's Plunge, but the queue and the station are what actually get you there, obviously. That's the part of the attraction where in a real park, you're not on the ride yet, but you're already supposed to feel like you're being pulled into that world a little bit. And this queue is a weird one to figure out. Like, the station is elevated, the plaza is compact, the coaster is running around and above parts of the area, and I didn't really have the option to just do one giant staircase straight up to the station. I mean, technically I could have, but it would have looked awful. It would have felt like this big theme park utility staircase slapped in the middle of Zora's Domain. And that's pretty much the opposite of what I wanted. So the main challenge here was figuring out how to get the guests up to the station gradually without making the queue feel like it was just fighting the land. I wanted it to feel like the path was built into the natural slope of the area. Not completely natural, obviously, because this is still Zora architecture, but I didn't want it to feel like flat terrain with some rockwork thrown around it after the fact. I wanted the queue to climb up with the land, wrap back on itself a bit, cross over previous sections, and feel like it was following the shape of the land. That was the idea, at least. Every turn, every ramp, every stair section had to be placed pretty carefully. If one part is too steep or too long, or doesn't line up with the next piece the right way, the whole thing starts to feel a bit clunky. So instead of one big staircase, I tried to break it into smaller moments, like a little ramp here, a turn back the other direction, a short stair run, another landing, another switchback, and then eventually you work your way up toward the station. And I think that helps a lot, because now the queue has a bit of movement to it. It isn't just walk straight up these stairs and get on the ride. You're kind of winding through this lower terrace area first, then climbing up along the side of the station, then turning back through these little planted sections and walls, and eventually you make your way up to the boarding area. It gives the queue a little bit of a journey type feel, even though it's not a huge space. That's something I'm trying to get better at with this park overall. I don't always need more land. Sometimes I just need to be smarter with the space I already have. In this queue here is a good example of that, because it's not really a massive footprint by any means, but by having it climb and fold back on itself, I think it feels like there's a little bit more going on than there actually is. And that's very much, what I go for with this park in general. I want things to feel layered. I want guests to see a path above them, or a coaster track crossing nearby, or a stairway turning into a little upper terrace, and feel like the area keeps going, like there's more to explore. That's one of the reasons why I like this Zora area so much. Even though it has been a pain at times, the elevation just kind of naturally fits the vibe. Zora's Domain shouldn't feel like a flat plaza just with blue buildings. It should feel like paths climbing around water, stairs built into stone, bridges crossing over little channels, structures sitting at different heights. So the queue gave me a chance to push that a bit more. The hard part was making sure it just didn't become a mess, right? Because when you start stacking paths and stairs and walls in a tight space, it can get chaotic pretty quickly, especially with the coaster right there. There's already track movement, there are already supports, there's already water, there's the station, there's the plaza behind it. So the queue needed enough detail to feel finished, but not so much that it would become impossible to read. And that's where the plants and the low walls helped a lot. I used those to sort of guide the path and make it feel intentional, but also to soften it a bit, because if it was just stone path, fence, stone wall, stair, fence, wall, it would probably just start to look pretty harsh. The greenery gives it some breathing room, and it ties it back into the natural side of Zora's Domain. And I know I talked about this in the last episode too, but I've definitely leaned heavier into greenery here than maybe the game version of Zora's Domain would, at least in some areas, but for the theme park version of this land, I think it works. It makes it feel less sterile. The marble and blue accents give you the Zora elegance, and then the plants and the rocks keep it from feeling too clean and too like hotel lobby-ish. That balance is kind of the whole land at this point. Elegant, but still natural. Designed, but still built into cliffs and water. And for the queue, that meant letting it feel like it was part pathway, part terrace, part garden, part ride entrance, not just a cattle pen with nicer railings. I also wanted to keep some sightlines open where I could, because one of the nice things about having the queue climb like this is that guests would theoretically get little glimpses of the plaza as they move around through it. You'd see the water, you'd see the coaster, the station above you, and it gives the whole area a bit more depth. That's the type of thing I really like in theme parks. And what really sucks me into theme parks, when things like a queue don't just hide you away somewhere, but it really lets you keep getting little pieces of the land from different angles as you move through it. It makes waiting feel less like you've just been removed from the area and more like you're moving through it. And that was important here because Zora's Plunge is so woven into the plaza and into this land. I didn't want the queue to feel too detached from that. I wanted it to feel like the queue is one of the layers in the plaza. And I should be clear, the plaza isn't just the coffee shop. I guess like it's extending past this queue line too. Like I have an open plot of plaza down below this too that I haven't gotten to yet. Probably won't get to till the next episode or one of the next episodes. But yeah, back to the queue. That's why I liked having it cross over itself a bit. Even if it's a simple thing, that kind of layered pathing makes the area feel more complex than it really is. You get that theme park thing where you can see where you were a minute ago, but now you're above it or around it or looking back across the space from a slightly different angle. It's a small detail, but it makes the queue feel more alive. The other challenge was that because this is a queue, it still has to read clearly. I can get away with weird little scenic paths in some areas, but for a ride queue, I don't want it to feel confusing. It needs to have some sort of logical flow from entrance to station. So I was trying to keep the shape interesting without it feeling like a maze. That's why the switchbacks here aren't just random. They're basically doing two jobs at once. They're giving me the capacity and length I need for the queue, but they're also helping the path climb the hillside and kind of the coaster station in a way that feels somewhat believable. And that was a big thing I was thinking about, believable, but not necessarily realistic, because obviously this is a Zelda theme park land in Planet Coaster. This is not me trying to make an actual civil engineering plan here. But I do want it to feel like, okay, somebody in this world thought about how guests would move from the lower plaza up to the station. It doesn't just feel like I realized the station was too high and panicked with the staircase, which, to be clear, I absolutely have done before, but I'm trying to be better than that now as I progress through this game and kind of my improvements in this game. And that fits the idea I had for this ride being almost like a ceremonial launch point too. Like the queue doesn't need a super literal story, but the movement of it can still create a feeling like you're leaving the public plaza and you're climbing into this more ride specific space before eventually boarding the coaster. And that's enough for me, honestly. I don't always need a giant pre-show or a fully explained backstory for every attraction. Sometimes the path, the architecture, and the way the land is arranged can do a lot of that work on their own. And that's what I was hoping for with this. The queue should feel like it belongs to the ride, but it also belongs to the land itself. It should feel like Zora architecture, but not completely disconnected from the rockwork and the terrain. I think Zora's Domain has forced me to think more about how everything connects: the coaster, the station, the plaza, the coffee shop, the bridges, the queue, the terrain. None of it really works if it feels like separate pieces. So this queue became one more piece of trying to stitch it all together. And once I started getting the path to feel like it was naturally climbing towards the station, and with that starting to work, finally we can start shifting toward the part of the ride that really needs to carry the name of the coaster. All right, so now we're finally getting into the part of the ride that really makes this Zora's Plunge. This was a section I had in mind pretty early on when I decided to use this coaster blueprint in Zora's Domain. Like I knew the plaza and station had to work, obviously, but the dive element was the thing that made me think initially like, okay, this could fit in this land really well. Because with Zora's Domain, especially pulling a lot from Ocarina of Time here, there's such a natural connection to diving and waterfalls and cliffs and pools and hidden areas, all that stuff. And I didn't want this to be a one-to-one recreation of anything from the game, because that's not really what I'm trying to do with this park. I'm not trying to copy and paste the map into Planet Coaster. It's more about taking, like I've said before, those memories and those feelings from the games and turning them into a theme park version of that. So for this section, I was definitely thinking about the diving game in Ocarina of Time, where you dive down in Zora's domain to earn the silver scale, not in a super literal way where every exact detail needs to be there, but more as the inspiration for this ride's big moment. The coaster climbs up through this waterfall, this cliffside area, hits the dive drop, and the idea is that you're almost taking the Zora dive yourself, like you're plunging down the other side of the waterfall into this lower pool area. That's the feeling I wanted, at least. And this is where the theming had to do a lot of the heavy lifting, because without the rockwork and water and architecture around it, it's just a dive coaster element sitting out in the open, which is totally fine as a coaster, but for this park that I'm building, it needed to feel like it belonged to the world. So the first big thing was trying to build out the top of the drop and make that feel like part of Zora's domain. I didn't want it to feel like you randomly, climb up this lift hill and then drop out of some generic rock formation. I wanted there to be enough architecture up there that it still feels like you're in the Zora built place. That was the thought behind adding some of these structural pieces near the top. It gives the drop a little more context, like this isn't just a cliff, it's part of Zora's domain. It has walls, openings, decorative pieces, water, obviously, and then the coaster is diving through that environment. But the tricky part here was the rockwork, actually. So that ended up being the longest and probably most annoying part of this whole section, because I was trying to hide the coaster structure and make the drop feel embedded into the cliff, but the rocks kept wanting to look like exactly what they were, like giant rocks placed around a coaster. And that's the problem sometimes with rockwork in this game, at least for me. Like, you can get the broad shape pretty quickly, but then making it feel natural is a totally different thing, especially when you're trying to wrap it around something very unnatural, like a vertical dive coaster track. And there were definitely points in the rockwork stage where it felt way too boxy, like I had built this big chunky rock tower around the track instead of looking like a cliff or a mountain dwelling. It looked like I was hiding something, which, to be fair, I was, but I didn't want it to look like that, obviously. That's where I started pulling in some of the language from the plaza border and really copy and pasting some sections from the last episode. So similar rock shapes, cliff textures, waterfall placements, and just trying to make it feel like an extension of that environment instead of a brand new object dropped onto the map. I think that helped a lot, because once the rockwork started tying back into the surrounding cliffs and the water, the whole thing felt less isolated for sure. It started to feel like this was part of the same Zora's domain landscape. The plazas down below, the station and queue lead you into the ride, and then this big dive structure becomes the more dramatic edge to the land. In the bottom section too, inside this kind of cliff dwelling, that was another important piece, because if the top is a setup, the pool area below is kind of the payoff, if you will. And again, this isn't meant to be a perfect recreation of the game, but I wanted it to evoke that feeling of diving down into an important Zora space. So the big stone doorway down here is sort of my version of that. It could be a gate deeper into Zora's domain, or an entrance into some important chamber, or even just a visual nod towards something like the water temple. And I know the water temple entrance is in Lake Hylia in the game, but for the theme park version of this, I'm more interested in the feeling of it than the exact map logic. It's supposed to give you that sense of, okay, we're entering something important now. The coaster isn't just dropping next to a waterfall, it's plunging into a lower Zora pool area. And that's what I wanted the signature moment of the ride to be. And that's also why I didn't want the bottom to just be a splash pool with some rocks around it. I wanted it to have a little bit of mystery to it. The stairs, the doorway, the water, the little stone pieces breaking the surface, all of that is meant to make it feel like there's more to this place than just the ride track passing through it. Like maybe this is a real part of Zora's domain that the ride has been built around. And that's kind of the sweet spot I'm always chasing with this park. I want the rides to feel like theme park attractions, but I also want the land to feel like it existed before the ride was placed there. Like the coaster is interacting with the world, not replacing it, if that makes any sense. And this section was a good test of that, because this is such a big coaster moment. It would have been really easy to let the drop dominate everything and just build scenery around it as an afterthought, but I wanted to kind of do the opposite. I wanted the scenery and the water and the Zora architecture to make the drop feel more meaningful. And then having water coming down around the lift hill and then surrounding the drop, it gives that feeling of diving through the other side of a waterfall, which is very much the type of of thing I associate with Zora's domain. It also gives the whole structure a little more motion, even when the coaster isn't running, which is important because this thing is going to be visible from a lot of different angles, at least the outside of it, like the lift hill. So by the end of the stage, it's definitely not perfect. I'm sure I'll come back and tweak some things here and there because that's just what I do. But compared to where it started with the exposed track and a bunch of empty land around it, it's definitely got a lot closer to what I had in my head. The station and queue give you that lead in. The plaza gives the area its life, but this drop is the moment where, you know, this coaster has to justify its name. This is the plunge of Zora's Plunge, you know. But even though we're building this dive section first in the footage here, the actual flow of the ride, there's another scene that helps set this up before the coaster ever gets to this moment. And that's where I wanted to pull from the approach to Zora's domain in Ocarina of Time, that whole Zora's river feeling where, you know, you're following the water up through the cliffs and eventually reaching that waterfall entrance into the domain. So this next part of the build is really about creating that lead in. Again, not an exact recreation, but something that gives the ride a little more of that journey towards Zora's domain before it climbs into the waterfall and then hits that dive. And then later on, the track passes back over it again, which helps to tie in the whole section together a bit more. Makes that river approach feel less like a one-off piece of scenery and more like the ride's full kind of layout. So now we're getting into that Zora's river inspired approach I was talking about a minute ago. And again, this isn't meant to be a direct recreation of Ocarina of Time. It's more like trying to capture that feeling of working your way up the river towards Zora's domain. You've got the water, the cliff edges, the path kind of weaving along it, and eventually that idea of reaching the waterfall where the domain is hidden behind. That was the general inspiration here. The actual ride flow, this section comes before the lift hill in the big dive moment. So after leaving the plaza, I wanted the coaster to have this little approach sequence before it gets to the main set piece. Not a huge story moment necessarily, but just enough to make it feel like the ride isn't immediately jumping from plaza to lift hill to drop. It gives the coaster a little bit of a journey first. And I think that matters for this ride because this coaster, Zora's Plunge, it's not meant to be just big drop the ride. The drop is obviously the signature moment, but I wanted the build up to feel like you're moving through Zora's domain too, like you're following the river upward, passing through the cliffs and slowly getting pulled toward the waterfall section before the ride opens up into that bigger plunge moment. So this part of the build was mostly about shaping that approach. The tricky thing with that is that the area also has to work from a few different angles. It's not just scenery for the coaster. Guests are going to see this from different angles of the plaza, from parts of the queue, probably from part of the exit path eventually, and then the coaster itself passes back over the section later on, so it can't just be a quick little throwaway bit of terrain work. So that's where I'm trying to keep using the same visual direction from the plaza and the dive section, the same kind of rock work, same waterfalls, same greenery, those little bits of Zora architecture mixed into the cliffs. I don't want each coaster scene to feel like its own separate thing. I want it all to feel like it's part of one connected domain. And that's honestly been one of the bigger challenges with this whole Zora build. It's not that any one piece is impossible on its own. The coffee shop, the plaza, the queue, the boarding station, the dive element, this river approach that we're building now, each one is manageable by itself, but getting them all to feel like they belong together without the area becoming too much, that's where it was getting tricky. Because like I keep saying, there's a lot going on here, but I do think this Zora's river section helps connect the ride a bit more. Without it, the coaster could start to feel like separate moments just kind of placed together. There's the plaza and the station, and then there's this kind of completely different section of the big dive and what leads up to it. But having this approach section gives the ride a little bit more flow. It gives you that feeling of moving through the land before the big moment happens. It's just not this jarring kind of transition from plaza to drop. It has that in between. This is really what this episode ended up being about, I think. The last episode gave Zora's domain more of like a lived-in plaza. It really set the tone for the theming, which actually, if I think about it, it's really the entrance is what gave kind of the direction for theming. The plaza just kind of built off of that. But this one's starting to make Zora's Plunge, the coaster, feel like it actually belongs in this area of the park. We got the station started, we got through the queue, we built out the big dive set piece, but this river approach kind of starts to give the coaster a little bit more of an actual ride path through the land. And now that we're pretty deep into this episode, I think I mentioned in the last one, this is supposed to be a two-parter, but at this point, looking at what's still left to do, I think it's pretty clearly becoming a three-parter. I think it makes sense to do that. There's still the ride exit to figure out. I've gotten the main footprint down for that, but not the inside portions for the ride exit. I'm planning on making that into like a gift shop that leads guests back to the Riverfoam Café plaza area, which I think could be a really cool way to make the exit feel more intentional instead of just dumping people back onto the path. And then also there's the plaza area next to the queue that still feels completely empty right now. It kind of butts up against the queue line, and I don't want it to just be this blank path area that exists because I needed like circulation space for the guest flow. That might be where maybe a flat ride comes in. I talked earlier in the last episode about wanting more flat rides in Hyrule Park, and this could be a good spot to test that out. Something that fits Zora's domain, adds some motion to the land. It makes that kind of lower plaza feel more substantial instead of just being a place people walk through. I don't know exactly what that is yet, if I'm being honest. I haven't got to that point in the build in real time, but you know, maybe something water-based, maybe something more graceful and fountain-like, but that's the kind of thing I want to figure out in the next episode. So I think this is kind of a good stopping point for part 2. We got the station, the queue, the dive moment, the river approach into a place where the ride is starting to make sense. I've not finished it yet, but it finally feels like Zora's Plunge has a real kind of identity forming. It's just about finishing that up. And next time we'll do that. We'll finish tying the rest of it together. But yeah, this is going to do it for this one. I hope you guys enjoyed. Definitely let me know what you think. And especially if you have any ideas for that possible Zora flat ride or lower plaza area, drop them in the comments because I could use the help there for sure. If you want to keep following along with Hyrule Park, please subscribe. I'll leave you with a few cinematics of where the area stands right now. Thanks as always for watching, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.